you. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the May SB 1383 Chat with CalRecycle. My name is Carla Miller from the Local Assistance and Market Development Branch, and I will be facilitating the webinar today. I want to do a quick shout out to Mallory Burden and Katie Koch, who will be helping out by running the slides and answering some of your questions in the Q&A function throughout the presentation. So thank you, Mallory and Katie. Today's webinar will focus on jurisdiction enforcement for organic waste recycling. We have reserved time after the presentations for a Q&A and peer matching session to give attendees the chance to ask questions and share any challenges experienced or interesting approaches and solutions. Now, to kick things off, I'd like to welcome Marshall Graham, our Local Assistance and Market Development Branch Chief, to share a few words.
Good afternoon. Welcome to everyone. And again, I'd like to extend appreciation for the planning team and all of our speakers and all of you in attendance. That's really where the value of these chats comes in. That's where we see the real power of us sharing our experience. With 2014, we started the first requirements of SB 1383 for enforcement, and jurisdictions are implementing all kinds of different models. And so this is an excellent opportunity we have today to address your questions and learn about your experiences with the implementation of SB 1383 enforcement. So welcome and thank you.
Thank you, Marshall. Before we dive into the presentations, I want to go over how to submit questions and comments. At the bottom of your Zoom window, there should be a speech bubble icon labeled Q&A. Or if you click more, which is indicated by the 3 dots. If you're not familiar with what this looks like, an example is on the slide right now. So once you click on that icon, it will open a window where you can formally submit your questions or comments to us. Please be specific with your questions. Include your name, affiliation, and who the question is directed to. If you're having difficulties with this Q&A function, you may need to check if your Zoom app needs to be updated, or you can simply email your questions to us at slcp.organics@calrecycle.ca.gov using the subject line SB 1383 Chat with CalRecycle. We will be monitoring that inbox during the webinar. However, we will not be monitoring the Zoom chat, but you're still free to use it to share information or resources with other participants. Okay, so now on with the show. We are very fortunate to have 3 excellent presentations lined up from City of Modesto, Stop Waste, and City of Monterey, and each will be sharing their enforcement experiences and approaches. Sorry, can you bring up the next slide, Mallory? That's okay. We'll just continue. After our presentations, we'll hopefully have about 45 minutes for Q&A, and then we'll wrap up by 3 o'clock. Can you pull up the first presentation, Mallory? Sorry about that confusion. And now my colleague, Jonathan Schmidt, will introduce the first panelist.
Hi, everyone. It's my pleasure to introduce Jody Strait. Jody Strait joined the City of Modesto as solid waste specialist in December 2023. She helps the city enforce AB 341 and SB 1383 compliance for commercial customers. Jody earned her Bachelor of Science in Environmental Sciences with honors and minors in public policy and journalism from UC Berkeley in 2018. She has 2 very spoiled rescue cats named Nix and Nova. Please take it away, Jody.
Hello, everybody. I'm just going to start my timer. Okay, hi. My name is Jody. I am, as Jonathan said, here with City of Modesto, and thank you all for taking the time to be here. So I'll go ahead and dive right into everything we're doing here to enforce SB 1383. So next slide, please. So in 2022, the City of Modesto provided a regulation flyer. That was the start of our SB 1383 enforcement. This was provided to commercial accounts specifically, and it summarized the expectations of commercial customers, changes to collection and sorting information. It summarized all the current waste management legislation, and it was provided in English, Spanish, and digitally as well. Next slide, please. And so the compliance timeline then, the regulation flyer was mailed out in 2022 to every single commercial account. In 2023, in January, the curbside recycling collection program was implemented. And so the city went from a 2-container garbage and organics collection to the 3-container garbage, organics, and recycling, or the black, green, and blue. And also began, so that was for the residents, to be clear, residential addresses. And then for commercial addresses and accounts, the city began conducting waste analyses for the 2,345 commercial accounts that are active within the city limits. And in 2024, by March, we completed waste analyses for each account, the 2,345 accounts. And I'll explain what that entailed later on. And so after we did that by March, our focus was able to shift to doing service level assignments, compliance checks, and notice and orders. Next slide, please. So the reasoning for why the waste analyses had to be done and why we've had to move to a service level assignment and compliance check is because in 2023, after beginning to deliver the 1383 compliant containers to businesses, the Modesto City Attorney notified solid waste staff that the municipal code actually does not allow the city to send containers to commercial accounts. Commercial accounts must change their own solid waste services with the 2 haulers that the city contracts with. And so the city can only provide recommendations for service levels based on those site visits or waste analyses. Next slide, please. And so this is just a brief overview of the waste analysis process that we've been doing for SB 1383, this process that we've done for over 2,300 businesses within the city over the last year and a half about. And so that started with actually compiling a list of commercial accounts and scheduling the waste analyses, and then performing those waste analyses on site and getting photographic documentation. And then we send a courtesy notice in the mail for any required service level changes to the commercial account, to the billing address on file. And if changes are not made, then it goes to code enforcement to take compliance actions. Next slide, please. So step 1 and 2 of this process, compiling a list of the commercial accounts. Prior to SB 1383, the city of Modesto actually did not hold records on commercial accounts. That data had to be collected from the 2 contracted haulers. And unfortunately, it was frequently outdated and inaccurate. And so once that database was compiled, then scheduling the waste analysis was started. And that inspection is scheduled typically the day before the solid waste service for that week, typically on a week-by-week basis. And that's just to make sure that we can get the greatest waste composition data. And the commercial account is not notified of the inspection. It is a surprise inspection. And so in the office, staff prepare the paperwork on, of course, the address and the business name and the current level of service, but also other helpful information like what the bin identification number is and any which hauler services that. Next slide, please. And so now step 3 would be conducting the waste analysis. So staff go out, they locate the container on site, and this can involve accessing locked bins, working with business employees to get access. Employees are provided with a letter from the solid waste enforcement supervisor explaining the purpose of the inspection. And if access cannot be gained, then city staff will schedule access with the hauler on the service day. And so once access is gained, then photos are taken and we use an automated date and timestamp. We capture the container ID and full view of the location or the enclosure and the contents. And we also label the containers if they're not already labeled. Next slide, please. So the container contents often does mean that staff doing the waste analysis have to open the bags. So they will use hay hooks, litter grabbers, puncture-proof gloves, and anything else needed as far as PPE goes, and take the photographs. And if the waste container is contaminated and the commercial account has the appropriate container for that contamination, then staff will also tag those containers, which can stop the garbage service until the issue is resolved. And for example, that would be like if there's recycling in the garbage container when the business already has recycling containers. And extra precautions are taken if the contamination is hazardous, which does happen sometimes. And then the staff record any other relevant information while on site, including, of course, the waste composition. So the percent of what we're seeing is garbage versus organic and recycling. And any units or number of units using that container. For example, if it's a multifamily dwelling or if businesses appear to be sharing the container, which then they would need to have a contract with the city to do that. Next slide, please. And finally, the last part of the waste analysis would be staff file those reports and upload the pictures and update the account records and report any tagged containers or immediate action to the waste hauler and the code enforcement officers. So any tagged containers are also entered into a completely separate database. Next slide, please. And these are just some photographs of a few different waste analyses. So we're looking at, how much of this is organic, how much of this is recyclable, and how much of it is garbage. And the photo on the left side there, you can see that those bags are not opened. So that would be something where they would need to be opened in order for it to be a proper waste analysis. Next slide, please. And an example here of what it looks like when we tag a bin. The yellow tag is more for like unsanitary conditions or if a lid is broken or a container is in need of repair. And then the pink tag is a more serious tag, which would actually stop the service if a container is contaminated. And the customer then has the opportunity to remove the contamination, schedule a reinspection, and then start their service again. And then on the right is just an example of getting that full view of the enclosure so we know what we're working with as far as the space constraint issues. Next slide, please. And when we get waivers for space constraints, one thing that I or other staff here at City of Modesto do is we go out and we actually measure the enclosure. And then we'll come back to the office and calculate, you know, what will actually fit in there based on the dimensions of the solid waste containers. Next slide, please. We also do compactor inspections. If we get a waiver application, for example, from a customer account that has a compactor, then we have worked with one of our haulers so far to go ahead and inspect those at the transfer station. So, yeah. Next slide, please. Okay, so once the waste analysis is done, then we move on to step 4, where the service level is reviewed and any changes that are needed are assigned and then mailed to the customer account. And so the solid waste staff use the waste analysis results to determine the appropriate level of service, and also will note any possible waiver options in case that waiver is applied for in the future. Then that saves us time. And then the service level change required letter, also referred here as the courtesy notice, is mailed out and saved in the customer's file. And then after that, the code enforcement staff will check for compliance after 20 days, and they will also hand deliver that courtesy notice. If the non-compliance continues, then a code enforcement case is opened and compliance actions will begin. Next slide, please. And so this is just an overview of what happens after the waste analysis inspection is conducted and the service level assignment is mailed. So that orange and purple box there. The customer can come into compliance right away, which is the vertical arrow there, which is great. We love that. But then they can also apply for a waiver. And so the waiver could be accepted and then they can come into compliance that way, or it could be not denied and they could then come into compliance. And if they don't do that, then you'd see that cycle down there in red begin, where they receive the notice and order. And they're given a specific amount of time. Once they receive the notice and order, a civil penalties hearing is scheduled. And at that hearing, the customer can either, they receive an administrative enforcement order or an extension by the hearing officer. So that's where we're looking at customers getting fines to compel them to come into compliance. And if they don't do that and 30 days of non-compliance pass, then it would go back to another hearing, and it can go up from a level 1 violation to a level 2, all the way up to a level 5. And the fines do escalate from there. At level 1, it's $100 a day to start, and then it could go all the way up to $25,000 a day at level 5. Next slide, please. So this is an example of what the change of service level letter looks like. And so the level of service needed is based on the waste analysis results and listed in this letter that is mailed to the commercial address, the billing address on file. The commercial accounts have 20 days to contact their solid waste service hauler and make the change to achieve compliance. The letter also offers them the opportunity to apply for a waiver. Next slide, please. And after 20 days, enforcement staff contact the hauler to see if the customer has complied with the required service level change. And if they have, then they're marked in compliance. If not, then a code enforcement case is opened. And another inspection is completed to verify that the customer, in fact, does not have any new containers. And while they're there, the code enforcement staff also hand deliver the courtesy notice outlining the changes that are needed. And if no changes have been made, then a notice and order is issued to the customer, giving them 20 more days to comply until the hearing is scheduled, and they would potentially face that $100 a day fine. And the notice and orders are mailed both certified and first class. Next slide, please. So a look at our compliance by the numbers as of March 2024. Of the 2,345 businesses, we had sent out 1,052 courtesy letters, and there were 419 customers in compliance, that green bar on the right. And then there were also 235 customers in enforcement. So they had cases opened. And we cannot, of course, do all of them at once because the customers that are in active enforcement, it is a legal process. It's very labor intensive, and we have limited staff that can actually handle those cases. So it was 235 in March. Next slide, please. And just a look at over the time from May 2023 up until March 2024, you can see that as the green bar, as the blue bar increases, that's the commercial accounts under active enforcement. Then the commercial accounts in compliance is increasing as well. So as these cases are opened, then the customers are coming into compliance eventually. Next slide, please. And on our challenges, one of the challenges has been not having access to the customer data from the start. We had to request that information from the haulers, compile a new database. That was before my time here. It was an immense amount of work, I'm sure, and it's a continuous process to keep that database updated. There was no ability for the city to change the service for commercial accounts on their behalf, and that procedure has had to adhere to the municipal code. So each customer must request their own service level change with the garbage hauler, the solid waste hauler, excuse me. And enforcement is our only way to achieve that compliance. And then, of course, limited staffing. We have one code enforcement supervisor, 2 code enforcement officers, and those are the only staff that can issue notice and orders. And then we have the solid waste specialist, myself, which is a new position that was created in 2023, and then a rotation of other staff that also complete inspections. And then space constraints. We have had to find some creative ways to make the containers fit for customers that have smaller enclosures. And repeated training is required to make sure that all businesses are treated equally, policies and procedures are being followed, and inspections sometimes have to be redone due to data going missing or improper execution, such as bags not being opened, things like that. Next slide, please. And our lessons learned, we hand deliver the notice of changes required when checking for compliance. That has been very helpful. So customers can, have that letter right in front of them to make the changes that are needed. And then we mail the notice and orders certified and first class, and that demonstrates that we've made every communication attempt possible for the hearing officer when they're determining whether they give the customer an extension or a fine. And then having those waste analyses in advance of the waiver application is beneficial for getting our waiver responses out in a timely manner. And also making sure that the data that we gather from in the field is protected. So we have had to limit staff access to databases and make sure that that's backed up regularly. Next slide, please. And this is my contact info. I know I went a little bit over, so thank you all for your time and for being here today. I look forward to answering any questions that you might have in the Q&A.
Thank you, Jody, for that overview of the city's process. As a quick reminder, we will address your questions after all 3 presentations, but feel free to submit them through the Q&A function at any point during the webinar. Mallory, oh, you got it. Thank you. We're now going to move on to our next panelist, who will be introduced by CalRecycle staff member Kathy Strictly.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming today. Kathleen, Strictly Cal Recycle. It's with great pleasure that I'm able to introduce Elise Lebsack from Stop Waste. Elise is a program manager and the enforcement lead for Stop Waste, which is a public agency governed by the Alameda County Waste Management Authority. For the last decade, Elise has been working on the agency's various ordinances regarding mandatory recycling and composting, reusable bags, and landfill tonnage fees. Her other agency work includes supporting use of compost and carbon farming in urban areas and rangeland across Alameda County. She is known for bringing empathy and kindness to the role of enforcement. That's a tall order, and I love that you can do that, Elise. Take it away.
Thanks, Kathleen. Yeah, I am glad to be here today and really glad to be presenting along with Modesto and Monterey. And yeah, excited to tell you all how we're doing it in Alameda County. So we can start with the next slide. For those of you who aren't familiar with Stop Waste, we are a JPA working on behalf of 17 member agencies in Alameda County, serving 1.7 million citizens. And our JPA is actually governed by 3 boards: the Alameda County Waste Management Authority, Alameda County Source Reduction and Recycling Board, and the Energy Council. Next slide. So, here we go. Sorry about that. To give some historical context, our jurisdictions have had mandatory recycling and organics collection and proper sorting requirements as part of a countywide ordinance over the last decade, started in 2013. And that ordinance had a phased-in approach, which began with 4+ cubic yard accounts, garbage accounts, and then also moved towards all size commercial and multifamily accounts over the course of that time. Our enforcement was inspection based, and in that time frame, we issued 2,500 citations for both lack of service and sorting violations. That ordinance was superseded by the Organics Reduction and Recycling Ordinance to implement SB 1383 regulations, and adopted by our jurisdictions in 2021. Next slide. While I definitely will be focusing on enforcement today, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that we have a robust technical assistance program and an array of outreach and education resources. You can find on our ordinance landing page of our website, stopwaste.org/rules. Next slide. So we have split up the enforcement between Stop Waste, our cities and haulers, and the county environmental health department. Stop Waste is taking the lead on enforcement of collection service requirements at commercial and multifamily accounts, as well as on waiver processing and documentation of alternative recycling. Jurisdictions and haulers are taking the lead on sorting and contamination requirements. And in the area of food recovery, we're partnering with the Environmental Health Department, who is assisting with compliance monitoring of permitted edible food generators. And we are doing inspections for sites that don't have environmental health permits. And then single family residential requirements are being handled by jurisdictions and haulers. Next slide. So to give you a sense of scope, we are monitoring and enforcing more than 20,000 commercial accounts and 7,500 multifamily accounts across 17 jurisdictions. This means gathering service level data from 12 haulers at least twice a year. And just as Jody was mentioning, that is its own challenge in and of itself. We do use a CRM database for all of our records, and with this ordinance, we added a portal that allows jurisdictions and hauler staff to view enforcement and related records. Next slide. So let's talk about fines. When we were moving into this ordinance, we knew that we wanted something obviously that complied with the state's regulations. We also really wanted to incorporate equity. In our previous ordinance, all accounts were issued the same level of fines, which led to small owner-operator businesses bearing the same financial responsibility as large multi-site corporations. We decided to use garbage size as an indicator of fine level and to combine that with frequency of citation issuance to move businesses up in the fine levels quicker. So as you see in the top row, we're dividing the fine levels based on those businesses that have less than 2 or more cubic yards of garbage per week at the lower levels, and those with 2 or more yards of service at the higher fines of 100, 200, and 500. The commercial edible food generator categories of tier 1 and tier 2 already fit well into that system of higher fines for larger businesses, as seen in the second row. And then lastly, we do have food recovery organizations and services at the lower level of fines, though we don't expect that we'll have many of those citations, given that all FROs at this point in our county have been reporting annually. Next slide. So now we're going to shift into discussing waivers and documentation of other arrangements of compost and recycling. So we initially decided to do a combination of site visits and desk approvals based on garbage size, business type, and number of employees, aiming to strike a balance between sufficient oversight and not being too administratively burdensome. Our issuance of recycling waivers has been much more conservative than organics only waivers because we know how prominent recyclable materials are. We are doing site visits also the day before garbage pickup, and which include a thorough review of what's in the garbage container, including opening and emptying bags to assess volume. And as on this slide here, it shows the kind of a visual reference for picturing material in 5-gallon buckets as a way to determine if they're under the 10-gallon or 20-gallon threshold. We also do a walkthrough of what's being thrown away in internal bins. One of the hurdles to approving waivers for non-food generating businesses has been pallets, which are usually made with untreated wood and that should be composted. And this has required working with haulers to make sure they'll accept pallets in the green bins and with cities to update their educational materials about acceptance of pallets. The waiver application for insufficient space, we are also pretty conservative or like tight around just being really scrutinizing how much about the efforts to right size or change container sizes and frequency. And of course, our process has shifted as we've gained more experience. For instance, we're no longer looking at number of employees as a deciding factor and have identified certain business types that do not require site visits due to the usual composition of their garbage. Mostly, I want to convey that you have enforcement discretion to decide what feels appropriate in your jurisdiction and that there isn't a one-size-fits-all approach. The second situation on the other side of the slide is for alternative service arrangements. So we have a separate process, somewhat similar to the waiver, but really it's gathering the information about how recyclables and organics are captured or diverted, if they are backhauling to a central location like a distribution center, if they're sharing bins with a neighboring business, or if they're self-hauling. In both situations, documentation has to be proactively submitted on our online form to prevent citations and fines. We do allow haulers and consultants and others to submit waiver applications and the certification of alternative service on behalf of accounts. And this has brought in more applications and a higher compliance rate for sites that meet the criteria. Next slide. So going on to our letters. So we started sending notice of violation letters in October of 2022 in weekly batches in cities across the county to the sites that lacked the required services. We started with the largest garbage generators and accounts that generate organics, and have at this point progressed through all sizes of bin-based and larger cart-based customers. We're now issuing to smaller sized accounts or new accounts that come in with each of our service level updates. And we'll continue sending NOVs to non-compliant accounts this year to any that haven't received one yet. So far, we've sent 6,000 accounts, NOVs, over the last 18 months, half of which are now compliant with service requirements. And some of those came into compliance after receiving a citation, but overall the 50% compliance rate is promising. Next slide. So if after 60 days of the notice of violation, a site doesn't obtain the required service or apply for a waiver or submit other documentation, a citation is issued. Sites that have a pending or approved waiver, alternative service arrangements, or have submitted some valid proof of service do not receive a citation. We have sent 5,000 citations in the last year, the majority of which are for lack of organic service, and a third of which still don't have recycling. I want to mention, kind of, if you think of that fine table, that the fines are issued per violation. So if a site with 2 or more cubic yards of service does not have recycling or compost, it's actually a $200 starting fine. And the fine levels increase up to $500 per violation for continued noncompliance, and those citations are issued every 60 days. So over time, those fines can add up to $3,000 to $6,000 a year, depending on if they're missing 1 or 2 services. This was one of the ways we really wanted to get at making the fine levels get attention for larger businesses that already are paying a lot of money at their garbage service. We have gotten feedback from member agencies and hauler representatives that they're seeing enforcement letters as effective at motivating action to come into compliance. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. Next slide. Although one of the actions required on the NOVs and citations is to submit proof of added service, not everyone does. So if a site receives a citation but had service prior to the date of the citation and were contacted with proof of the timing of service, we can and do dismiss citations. If service was added or a waiver was applied for after the date of the citation fine is still due. There does seem to be a misperception by accounts that they don't have to pay if they come into compliance or submit their proof of service. So we found it helpful to emphasize start date when communicating with accounts. Our messaging is that adding the required service will prevent future citations, but not past due fines. We currently have around a 13% dismissal rate, which is in part due to only receiving service level updates twice a year from the various haulers in our county. We're able to avoid some dismissals by receiving proof of service from hauler reps and consultants in an ongoing basis, particularly in those 2 months after the notice of violation is sent and before a citation is issued. Next slide. So I want to mention a detail about how we're mailing letters, and I'm actually really glad to hear how Jody is doing it in Modesto, because it has changed for us over the last couple of years. Under our previous ordinance and for the beginning of 1383 enforcement, we sent all enforcement letters via certified mail, and this provided strong evidence that the regulated party received their notice because it requires a signature, by the regulated party, and then we get the receipt with that delivery information and signature. The challenge with certified mail is that it is significantly more expensive than first-class mail, particularly when you're sending thousands of letters. We also found that the return rate for certified mail was double from what it was under our previous ordinance. We're thinking it may be higher because COVID shifted more business operations to working from home, and that there was not always someone available to sign for delivery. Sending notices and citations certified is not required by law, and we know of at least a couple other government agencies that send their enforcement letters first class. Additionally, the labor it takes to prepare and send letters certified limited our capacity on the number of letters we could send per week. So we shifted our process to sending all letters first class last summer, and now we rely on whether a letter has been returned to know if the letter wasn't received. The process is definitely more efficient and cost effective, but it does mean that we have more dismissals of letters because we can't as easily prove that the letter was delivered and received. Next slide. So we're sending out thousands of citations and fines, and they need an easy way to pay. We use a third-party vendor to process our payments and manage delinquency notices and collections. They also administer appeal hearings on our behalf, so the cited party has a third-party hearing officer that is not paid for by us. We initially had around a 35% payment rate over the first 6 months, which was relatively similar to what we experienced from our previous ordinance. But after internal discussions and feedback from partners, we made some changes to the citation letter to make it more clear how to pay, and changed our envelope to indicate it contained an enforcement letter. These changes, and possibly the shift to smaller accounts, has increased our payment rate to 46%. Revenue will obviously depend on your fine structure and number of citations sent. Our enforcement is compliance focused, not revenue focused, and the money from citations does not cover our costs. But that said, just in our first year of issuing citations, our revenue was around $240,000. Next slide. I know it may come as a surprise, but some businesses do not agree with their enforcement letters. Joking aside, it is necessary and required to include a process for regulated parties to contest and appeal administrative citations. And for good reason. Sometimes a site has extenuating circumstances that we may not know about from an administrative review of their service level and enforcement history. Our process includes making a written request within 30 days of the citation date and including the fine amount as bond. Our third-party vendor schedules the hearing with a hearing officer and then manages all of the communication with the appellant before and after the hearing. If the appeal is overturned and found in our favor, then the fine amount on bond is forfeited and used to pay the citation. And if the appeal is upheld, then the bond amount is returned to the appellant. So the most common reason for contesting violations is usually if a site already has service or thinks they don't need service. So we make sure to provide information about submitting proof of service and applying for waivers to prevent unneeded appeal requests. And even after the 30-day window of time for appeal, we still receive inquiries about wanting fines dismissed. So we're just making sure that we're really consistent with our responses and only dismiss violations and citations if documentation is provided that shows the citation was issued in error. Next slide. So over the last year, over 50% of non-compliant accounts have come into compliance with the collection service requirements, with about half of them getting the collection services and about half getting approved waivers or certification of alternative service. for their self-haul, backhaul, or shared service. In the first year of enforcement, we focused on commercial accounts with 2 or more cubic yards of total weekly service, which are those 1826 accounts that CalRecycle placed increased importance on. We estimate that 95% of those accounts are now compliant countywide. But as we all know, 1383 does require that all size accounts are compliant. And currently we're at about 83% of commercial accounts in Alameda County overall, though it definitely varies by jurisdiction. About 95% of multifamily properties across the county are also compliant. I want to point out that this is definitely a joint effort between member agencies and hauler staff because they play such key roles in subscribing the accounts and working towards compliance in other areas. Yeah, I would just want to lastly mention documentation. I've mentioned it a few times and want to remind you how important it is to build systems for tracking all your steps and your communications. This is needed for successful dismissals and appeal hearings, but also just helps build a program that you can firmly stand on and that it's transparent. It doesn't mean that things won't change, but it definitely builds a solid foundation. And as I mentioned before, like each jurisdiction will have a different enforcement program that fits the needs and uniqueness of their own communities. You don't need to do the enforcement the way we have, but you're definitely welcome to use elements and approaches I've shared if they're helpful. The most important thing for me is to have a consistent and transparent enforcement process, and to hold compassion for how that enforcement is landing at the personal level or at the business level. The regulations aren't negotiable, but how I show up with businesses and people goes a long way to make the process feel better. Last slide is just wrapping up my presentation and look forward to taking your questions during the Q&A period. Thanks.
Thank you, Elise. And now our final panelists will be introduced by CalRecycle staff member Laura Chain.
Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you're all having a happy Wednesday. Our next presenter is Mallory Pankritz. Mallory is a sustainability assistant for the city of Monterey. She has worked in Monterey's sustainability office since 2018 and recently received her master's degree in environmental law. Through her role with the city of Monterey, she took the lead on AB 1826 compliance while implementing other solid waste programs. She is now enforcing SB 1383's organic waste collection requirements and chairs the Regional Enforcement Subcommittee. Please give a warm welcome to Mallory.
Great, thank you so much, Laura. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mallory, and during this presentation, I'm going to provide some details on Monterey's organic waste collection enforcement strategy, as well as some information on regional efforts. So let's get into it. Next slide, please. To provide some background, the city has an exclusive solid waste franchise hauling agreement with Monterey City Disposal Service. Monterey City Disposal provides source-separated organic waste collection through which residents and businesses separate material into 3 containers. The Monterey City Disposal Commercial Recycling Guide is pictured right there on the right. Food scrap collection is available to businesses, and that's primarily utilized by restaurants, whereas mixed organics collection is available to both businesses and residents. And then the organic waste is hauled to the composting facility at Regen Monterey, which is our local solid waste district. And they utilize a windrow composting system operated by Keith Day Company. So something else I wanted to mention just regarding Monterey's enforcement background. As you know, CalRecycle did not require local adoption of AB 341 and AB 1826 requirements like it did with SB 1383. However, the city of Monterey incorporated those requirements into city code anyway, because otherwise there would be no enforcement mechanism. So this really helped with establishing compliance for those regulations, but it also provided a solid foundation for incorporating and enforcing 1383's requirements. Next slide, please. So first I want to touch on outreach efforts and resources we've created because they've been a really crucial part of achieving compliance. So we focus on education first and provide every opportunity to comply prior to initiating the enforcement process. And I include links and attach relevant resources in almost every email that I send. Even if they say they already have it, I'm like, here's another one just in case. And I don't expect you to read all of these, but pictured here are the 2 gallon pails local jurisdictions have been providing to residents free of charge. A flyer developed by Regen Monterey. A few pieces from recent Monterey City disposal mailers that go out to all residential and commercial accounts. An Instagram post, and then a photo of the city's table at Whale Fest, which is a local educational event. In addition to these items, we use recycling guides like on the previous slide, postcards from Regen Monterey, social media content, newsletters from the city of Monterey. We table at events, and then of course we do conduct site visits and presentations. And currently an enforcement toolkit is being developed by Blue Stripe Environmental in collaboration with local jurisdictions. So it's intended to be a resource for all jurisdictions in the county who may not have as much background on 1383, so particularly code enforcement staff. And Blue Strike is currently in the process of creating resources such as an introduction to 1383, a checklist for code enforcement to use to get started, an introduction to Recyclist, best practices for communication styles and setting up organic waste service, and then of course the actual enforcement requirements. They're also compiling resources from Recyclist, CalRecycle, and jurisdictions. And then once the toolkit is up and running, local jurisdictions will be able to share resources as they're being developed. Next slide. All right, now we can get into the actual enforcement process. So first, the Sustainability Office issues a notice to the Monterey City disposal account holder. Pictured here is our first notice template to multifamily properties. And then when they call or email in response to the notice, I educate them about the program and ask about waste generated on site, discuss compliance options. And if they maintain that they don't generate much organic waste, I ask them to provide estimates of how much food waste and yard waste is generated on site per week, as well as information on specifically how and where yard waste is disposed of. And because I want unbiased estimates, I do try to request this information before talking about the exemption threshold if possible. And then after that, the next step is to check the Monterey City disposal database to see if organic waste collection was added or get completed waivers and certifications. So after that, the next round is issuing final notices if the account is unresponsive, service hasn't been added, and no form was received. So final notices are generally sent to the account holder and property owner if they're separate parties. Then once again, I check the Monterey City disposal database and get certification forms. If they're still not compliant at this point, I give them a courtesy phone call, just letting them know how to establish compliance and that the next step would be a citation. So this just gives them another opportunity to correct non-compliance. So by the time they start receiving citations, if they get to that point, it's not a surprise because there's an adequate record of efforts to establish compliance. And after that is the citation. So we issue up to 3, and if they're still not compliant after 3 citations, they're referred to the city attorney's office and then continue through the city code enforcement process. during which our office works with the city attorney to issue a compliance order. At this point, we do occasionally work with other departments or agencies, such as code enforcement staff, the police department, or the health department. The more egregious solid waste management offenders are usually breaking several laws across various disciplines. So checking with others and working together can be very helpful and provide a better picture of the account that you're trying to bring into compliance. Overall, the enforcement process is pretty time consuming, especially as you get down to like the last 10 to 15% of non-compliant accounts. They just tend to require more effort. Next slide, please. So here we have waiver application, self-hauling certification, and on-site composting certification forms available on our website. That's the picture on the left. We require that quantified estimates of organic waste be included within the form for record-keeping purposes. And for self-haulers, we also require the location where waste is being hauled to. And for on-site composting, we require a photo of the on-site composting operation. And for accessibility purposes, we also have a Word document that can be printed and mailed to residents that don't use or don't have access to computers. And that's the one on the right. Next slide. So our region uses the Recyclist database to track compliance. It utilizes data imported from waste haulers and provides a compliance overview for each account. I use it to track all correspondence, including notices, emails, citations, and photos, as well as details on conversations I've had over the phone. I also record contact information for the appropriate individual to work with. This has been very important as I found that many businesses have a pretty high turnover rate, which can affect their compliance. Organic waste just tends to get lost in the shuffle. And I cannot overstate how helpful it is to keep detailed records on who you spoke with and the nature of the conversation. It will come up if the account receives a citation and you need to provide the history on your efforts to achieve compliance. And then, of course, letters, emails, phone calls, and other information can be critical during hearings and continuing through the legal process. Next slide. So I do have a couple of things of note that I thought might be useful to other jurisdictions. Here's some eye candy to look at just while I'm talking. These are all photos of Regen Monterey's composting operation. So with noticing, I started with multifamily properties. I figured there would be more exemptions with commercial accounts, and I wanted to get as many people going as possible. I'm glad I did because that's exactly how it went. And with property managers, I grouped as many properties as possible into one notice just for the sake of efficiency. Implementing AB 1826 gave me a really good head start on compiling property contacts. And then when they contact me, I can hopefully go through one contact to achieve compliance at several properties. And then I always provide property managers with the link to our website and outreach materials so they can provide resources to tenants. And I always make sure to tell them they're welcome to provide my contact information to tenants as well, just in case they have any questions. There are a few common clarifications I need to make. So most commercial accounts assume this only applies to restaurants. So just clarifying that 1383 applies to all businesses. And understandably, I do frequently need to clarify that this is different than AB 1826. A number of accounts, especially those who have received 1826 waivers, have been confused and think that they already established compliance. Which leads me to courtesy calls. So I highly encourage making a phone call just as one last effort prior to issuing a citation. It is very time consuming, but many people really appreciated the heads up. And if some extra phone calls avoid a compliance order, it's worth it. And then finally, yeah, critical to enforcement is interpreting the regulations first and consistently implementing them to all. And persistence with follow-ups demonstrates that this is being actively enforced. So just follow up when you say you're going to follow up. Next slide. And so to end the presentation, I've included a screenshot of Monterey's compliance dashboard. I'm happy to say we're currently at 91% compliance. I actually just hit 91 this morning. And below I've included our website and Instagram. And then if anyone wants to send me any questions directly, my email is right there. And that concludes my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mallory. And actually a big thank you to all three presenters for sharing your jurisdiction's efforts and experiences. Let's give them a warm virtual round of applause. Okay. Now we'd like to open it up for our Q&A and peer matching session. So as a reminder, please submit your questions and comments using the Q&A function. You may continue to use the chat to share information with participants. However, we will not be monitoring that chat. Once we get your question, CalRecycle staff will unmute you. You will be prompted to state your name, affiliation, and ask your question. We will try to get to as many of these questions as possible related to our webinar topic. But if we do not get to your question, you could submit it to our SLCP mailbox, which is slcp.organics@calrecycle.ca.gov with the subject line SB 1383 Chat with CalRecycle, and we will follow up after the webinar. With that, I will go ahead and pass it on to Katie.
Right. The first question that we have in our queue is from Tammy Stolzenhauer. Tammy, you should be able to unmute now. Please go ahead and ask your first question and state your name and affiliation. Thanks.
Yes, thanks for taking my question. I'm here with the City of Watsonville Works and Utilities, and we are a solid waste hauler jurisdiction, and I'm the environmental projects analyst. Would like a little more clarification on the differences and definitions between contamination fees and enforcement in the guidelines. So my question is, are contamination fees or fines considered enforcement, or for non-compliance in most of our 1383 ordinances the only form of enforcement? In the annual report year, the difference in what you mean by between violations and enforcement. Yeah.
Okay. I'm sorry. You were maybe breaking up just a little bit. So just to make sure that we are, all able to hear to get the question, I'm just going to go ahead and read what you typed in the Q&A pane. Are contamination fees or fines considered enforcement, or are fines for non-compliance in our 1383 ordinances the only form of enforcement? What are the differences between violations and enforcement in the annual report year? And
So for this one, this is Marshall Graham, branch chief. I do have this question into the enforcement group for clarification, so we'll be following up. But I did note that under route reviews and the regulations, it requires reporting certain information about violations, but in the on another tab, it has some more specific requirements. So I'm just detailing out what's required for each one of those tabs in our electronic annual report so that we can get you that information.
all right, and Tammy, we can follow up with you via email on that one once we have a final answer. I'm going to move on to your second question. I hope it's all right if I just read it for you. Second question is a waste hauler allowed to charge contamination fees to a LEA, a school, or no? As jurisdictions are not allowed to enforce on LEAs. Oh, Carrie, you're muted at the moment.
There we go. I'm free.
Sorry about that.
No worries, no worries. So and feel free to provide any follow-up clarification. So, I'm not with the scenario that you presented, if the school district, that local education agency, has contracted with the hauler, depending on what's in that contract or that agreement, will determine if a hauler can charge any penalties for contamination fees. Typically, there's nothing that prohibits that I'm aware of. I think if there was a situation where the school district was participating in the local jurisdictions program, then certainly the same would apply. If it's allowed in the local jurisdiction program, then the hauler would be allowed to do that. I think when we talk about enforcement, when it comes to penalties for contamination, right? That's a little bit different than an enforcement action. So did that help answer the question? I don't know if any of our panelists have any more that they would like to add. Did that address it?
Yeah, this is Tammy, and I have a
Oh, hey,
different
Tammy.
headset on now. But yeah, that helps. I'm just looking for more clarification, because in the annual report it says, well, violations, penalties, enforcement, and I get confused between the three.
Yeah.
And also, not that we want to be enforcing against LEAs if we don't need to, but it's like, okay, well, we're not supposed to enforce against them, but I see some waste haulers. I'm hearing that some waste haulers are charging hefty contamination fees against a school. And so I get confused if that's enforcement or violations or penalties or what it is.
Yeah, those are really good questions. And, in the contamination monitoring section of the EAR, there is a field, let me get to it. So it comes under waste evaluations, and there is a number of notices, violations, or targeted education materials issued to generators. So if that violation was in the form of a penalty, you could certainly, that would be the appropriate place to make note of it, because this section is regarding contamination monitoring. So that would be the place to put it, Tammy. Does that help? And again, Rachel, we'll let you chime in as well. And the last thing I would say on that, Tammy, it also is going to depend on your program. So for example, if the city is providing the collection service to that local education agency, and they're just one of many of your commercial customers, then you could report on it. But if the school district has its own contract with a hauler, maybe it's the same hauler, you are not obligated to report to us on that. So it just kind of depends on where your responsibility when it's contamination monitoring and what's going on there. So and happy to tease that out a little bit further with you. Rachel?
Yeah, I just wanted to add from our perspective and serving multiple jurisdictions that as Kara mentioned, in some cases, a jurisdiction's franchise will cover services to school districts, for instance. In other cases, they will not. And the school district is considered a state agency and has their own contract. If they are included in the franchise agreement, then the franchise agreement may have contamination fees that are built into it. And my interpretation of the SB 1383 regulations is that contamination does not have to go to a fine level, but if it's embedded in franchise agreements or the hauler is allowed to do that through the contract with the city, then it could.
Spot on, Rachel. Tammy, did that help? Oh, go ahead, Tammy.
Okay, thanks. I was able to unmute that time. This helps a lot because I lead an auditing team. And so the way we characterize it in our records out in the field, I need to be able to define it for our team too. So yes, I realize that in the ear really for contamination monitoring, that's one category. And then like enforcement would be more like, administrative fines.
Yes. Yeah,
So
exactly. For not having collection service, for example, or an edible food generator that's not complying.
okay, understood. Thanks for clarifying.
Yeah, sure.
I should perhaps have mentioned this earlier, but we are unable, or once you have unmuted to ask your question, it will be difficult for us to unmute you again. We have to go back through the list and find your name again. So if at all possible, we do ask that you please, once we've enabled you to unmute, if you're able to, please remain unmuted until we've properly addressed your question. It'll make things just a little bit easier for you. Our next question is going to be from Kira Lowe of Joint Venture. Kira, please go ahead and unmute and ask your question.
Hi, yeah, thanks. Kira Lowe at Joint Venture. I was just wondering, Elise, it was really helpful to hear about your equitable fine structure and split between tier 1 and tier 2 generators. I was wondering if you could share any more about how the enforcement system you talked about relates to edible food recovery, if it's the same or if there are differences. Of course, you mentioned the inspections are happening through environmental health sometimes, but if the enforcement process looks the same, if you're willing to speak to that, and if not, no problem.
Yeah, thank you. I'll answer the initial part, then I'll actually probably pass it over to Rachel, who's been doing a lot of the coordinating with our environmental health department. So I would say the enforcement, once it gets to the citation level, the enforcement is the same. It's really, the difference is really in the inspection process that environmental health inspectors are doing site visits. And based on that site visit, they are giving the business, the restaurant, or whatever permit holder it is, a inspection report that serves as their notice of violation. And then they're also following up with them, I think 2 weeks later, giving them like a 14-day window to come into compliance. And only if they are still non-compliant after those 14 days will their names then get passed to us for continued non-compliance. So really the bulk of the edible food generators are being handled at the NOV level through the environmental health department, unless it's a non-permitted site, like a food distributor or somebody who's not selling to the public, in which case then we are doing those inspections and issuing an NOV. So Rachel, is there anything else there?
Yeah, I think you covered most of it. I mean, it just is that, so each of our member cities or jurisdictions have an MOU with the county environmental health department. And so that covers those inspections. The jurisdictions are paying for the inspections, and the inspection also covers the issuance of an NOV. But that's where their role stops, essentially, and that then they will pass it along to us to issue the citation. That actually hasn't quite started. We're still working through all those various details of coordination, how we're going to get timely information. But they have done the last 2 years of inspections prior to enforcement being required this year. So we're hopeful that that initial communication coming from the environmental health department, who is already inspecting many of those accounts, will be an effective mechanism to get them to come into compliance soon so that we don't have to do a lot of citations, but we'll be the holder of that once they are referred to us.
Okay, thank you. That's so helpful. And so it sounds like even though there's the 14 days, sort of, I imagine the NOV timeline is still the same. It kind of enters your timeline once the NOV is kind of handed to them at the end of the inspection. Is that right?
Yeah, they wouldn't be issued a citation before 60 days. That's for sure. Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much.
All right, our next question is for Jody Straight, and it is coming in from Angela Rita. Angela, you should be able to unmute. Please state your name and affiliation and ask your question.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Awesome. My name is Angela. I'm the admin assistant for a small special district, or Wrightwood Community Services District. And my question is in regards to the space constraints. Jody mentioned that they had to get creative about how to fit bins into areas where there wasn't a lot of space, and that is a huge challenge for us right now. A lot of our bins are just in our streets or they're blocking sidewalks, so we're kind of stuck. So anyone really with any tips or tricks on that or what they've done, I'd love to hear it.
Yeah, thank you for that question, Angela. I'll speak to it a little bit. The extent of what I've done to fit containers into enclosures is more so when commercial accounts apply for those physical space waivers, then I will go out and with a measuring tape and I'll actually measure the enclosure size and then also document with photos any other spaces on the property where a bin or container, whether it's the bin or the 90-gallon, could go. And then when I come back to the office, I'll actually, right now I just do it in PowerPoint. There might be a better way to do this, but I actually do a diagram with the measurements of the enclosure and then the measurements of the bin. And so I'll play around with like, well, right now they might have a 4-yard bin, but let's see, will it fit? Will 2 bins, one garbage and one organics fit if they go down to the 2 yards? And then sometimes we have also gone out and met with, for example, a multifamily. We met with the owner and we discussed it with them, and we found that, well, it's really better suited for them to keep their garbage dumpster and still have it as it was, because we had initially thought about turning it, getting a smaller size and then putting 2 in there and turning them. But instead we decided to allow them to just keep the garbage bin and then just do carts. And we walked the property and found another location where they were already keeping some carts. And so we resolved that issue that way. So yeah, I hope that helps, but I don't know that that would resolve, if your bins are blocking the sidewalk or anything like that. That's certainly not something that we would really allow for.
All right, thank you, Jody. Our next question is going to be coming in from Kimberly Pena. Kimberly, you should be able to unmute. Please state your own name and affiliation and ask your question.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kim Pena. I am with Republic Services. I'm an environmental manager overseeing about 15 different locations. And so my question is, whenever it is that we encounter our legal enforcement agency having a specific kind of definition of SB 1383, that then they turn around and kind of implement new either sampling requirements or requirements in general, I've kind of struggled with not knowing how to maybe question that and how to get with CalRecycle to maybe be the mediator and have CalRecycle explain certain situations, because CalRecycle supersedes maybe even what the LEA thinks as far as SB 1383. So is there someone we can reach out to at CalRecycle?
Yeah, hey, thank you for that question. Yeah, first, I think start with your local assistance liaison, and happy to set up a meeting with, or conversation with the LEA, the local education agency, and you just provide that clarity. We've done that with a number of school districts that are local education agencies, so that we could easily do. It would help us to know like what the questions are so we can be prepared. But yeah, happy to do that.
Okay, thank you. And my second question is, sorry, I wrote it down here somewhere. I didn't know when you were going to call me, so let me go search for that really quick. Let's see. The second question is, are there any specific kind of workshops or trainings that is hands-on training or workshops that we can maybe attend throughout the year to, number one, be able to understand the process better that specifically is for our sites, and then number two, just to be able to ask our questions, because I recognize that a lot of the different facilities may have questions that come up that we don't know where to turn to really have them answered.
I think I need a little more clarity.
Okay.
Are you talking about facility measurement? Or
so I'm talking about each one of the facilities that I'm the EM for, they have different maybe streams that are coming in, which require different samplings. And so a lot of them at the facilities aren't totally clear on step 1 through 10 as far as how do I handle this? How do I document it? What is this report I now have? How do I fill out this log? And so is there a comprehensive training or workshop that we can attend?
Yeah. So there's a couple things. We have training videos on the website. We do at our technical training series for operators, we hold extensive trainings. So why don't we do this? We'll set up a follow-up with you and connect you with our team that is working with facilities and get you, all of the training tools that they provide. And then if there's a need, if you're seeing a need that there's some on-site training needed at a particular facility, then we can also coordinate with them to make that happen. And you can be invited to that.
Yes. I think that's what our team really needs, is a hands-on training where we're also able to ask them whatever questions may come up.
Yeah, no problem. Sounds good. We'll connect. The team is under Kathy Blair, and so yeah, I think we've got your email. Is that right, Katie?
I should be able to pull it from the Zoom records.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, we will do a follow-up and get you connected and get some technical assistance with your facilities and you, so everyone's clear on measurement.
Amazing. Thank you. I appreciate your time.
Yeah, no, thanks for bringing it up.
All right, thanks all. Our next question is from Michael Renfro, and I'm just going to go ahead and answer that real quick. He's looking for the answer to Tammy's question. I'm going to ask you to please refer to the video once we post it onto YouTube. If you are on the SLCP listserv for CalRecycle, then you will receive a notification once we have posted this video to the YouTube website. And if you are ever having trouble finding a specific piece of information in a YouTube video that you are confident is in there, please go ahead and email us at slcp.organics@calrecycle.ca.gov. And we will do our best to go back through our chat logs and Q&A logs to find the specific information you're looking for. So this is one, please go ahead and follow up with us via email, Michael. Thank you. Next up, we have a question from Yvette Rodriguez. Yvette, you should be able to unmute now. Please go ahead and unmute and state your name and affiliation and ask your question.
Hi, good afternoon. I was wanting to ask the cities that have purchased the compost buckets or pails so far, if they can tell us if they're useful, if they found that they are actually being used to place kitchen scraps inside, or do you find that they're not using them at all? Because we haven't purchased those yet, and we're deciding whether it's worth purchasing and distributing out to our residents.
So I'd be happy to answer that. All of the feedback I've received about the pails has been extremely positive, and we've handed out a lot of them, so I can't say I know how every single one is being used, but overall, I would say they are being used for their intended purpose. And they also just make the public feel very supported because they're getting this, free pail to help them comply with the requirement. And then the pail itself has guidance, like a sticker on the front of it saying exactly what goes in, what doesn't go in. So yes, I would say they have been using it for food scraps and lots of positive feedback.
Thank you.
Jody or Elise, do you have anything to add? Oh, Jody, please go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to echo what Mallory just said, that every time I give out one of those food scrap pails to a resident, they're usually very happy, and I can't say to confirm whether or not they're being used for that intended purpose. It certainly seems like it, just based on how appreciative they are when they come down to City Hall to pick one up.
Yeah, I can add that although we don't give out, because we're not working at the single family residential level, we do provide indoor green bins for commercial businesses. And our technical assistance team has provided pails, indoor pails for multifamily residences in the past. And it just feels like a helpful infrastructure to get people past the ick factor of needing to figure out some way to transport things from inside to their outside containers. And, it's helpful to include information about whether that pail should be lined or not. More likely, we encourage people to not line their bin and to just rinse it afterwards. But I would say we've definitely gotten feedback that it's helpful infrastructure.
All right, thank you. Our next question is going to be from Paul Freund. Paul, give me just a moment to find you from amongst the Pauls on the meeting. Okay, here we go. You should be able to unmute now. Please go ahead and state your name and affiliation and ask your question.
Great, thank you. Yeah, Paul Freund with the Tehama County Solid Waste Management Agency. I was just asking if, during an inspection of a commercial edible food generator, the inspector observes that the contract or written agreement that's required between the commercial edible food generator and the food recovery organization isn't signed by both parties, meaning both the commercial edible food generator and the food recovery organization. Would that be justification for the inspector to issue an NOV?
That is a good question. We don't tend to get very prescriptive on strict requirements for these contracts.
Okay.
However, they do have to satisfy the basic contractual requirement of there being an offer and acceptance. I would need to consult with a lawyer to determine whether or not an unsigned contract would be worth anything in this situation. I suspect the answer may be no, due to the whole acceptance portion of the requirement. But this is something I think we will actually need to follow up with you in writing about later.
Oh, okay.
All
Because
right.
if I could
Hey.
like rephrase it in a more simpler way.
Yeah, Paul.
I mean, it's
and-
required that
Hey,
an
Paul,
agreement,
just
so yeah, it's required that an agreement is in place, but
Mhm.
absent signatures from both parties, is it an agreement?
Yeah, so I think to Katie's point, Paul, that, you know, the regs speak to having a contract or agreement, right?
Yeah.
And I think if you are, as a part of that inspection, you're finding that the donations are happening, right? Then, you know, sounds like that agreement is working and in place. So I think you want to just kind of, I think it takes a little bit more fact finding. You know, if for some reason that agreement didn't take effect because one of the parties didn't sign it, then that could be a trigger, right? Because then you're going to see that donation is not happening. But just the fact of not having a signature doesn't necessarily mean that there's a violation or an issue.
Okay, so then let me phrase it a little different.
Yeah.
So the inspector goes to the commercial edible food generator to
Mhm.
conduct the inspection.
Yeah.
They're looking for the various parts that are identified in the inspection section of the regulations, which would be a copy of a contract or a written agreement, which would be records of pounds of food donated, you know, record showing, I think, on a monthly basis. The contact information for the food recovery organization or service that's collecting from them. So if they're looking at this and they see, you know, they're recording pounds, they're you know, able to find contact information. It may not be, you know, readily available on a contract or something, but they're not able to provide a contract. But then they provide the contract later on, and the contract does not have a signature, but they have been donating food. Records have been kept of the food that's been donated. It just doesn't seem like it satisfies all of those necessary boxes that the inspector is looking for to check off on, which are clearly identified in the inspection section of 1383 and in the section that identifies the record keeping requirements of the commercial edible food generator. So then wouldn't that be a violation, or that you're saying that wouldn't be a violation because they're donating food, regardless of whether the agreement satisfies maybe a lawyer's interpretation of an agreement?
Yeah, I mean, you've added to your scenario here. So always I want to disclaim, you know, kind of based upon the facts you're presenting would be my response. So yeah, I mean, it sounds like if those pieces are missing that are required in the regulation for what needs to, what that commercial edible food generator needs to have for their records, then that that would warrant a violation. But just not having a signature per se, which is what you started with. But the additional facts that you provided, you know, not having a copy of that agreement, right? That's problematic because that certainly is a requirement.
Okay, so it's more so the fact of either producing the document would trigger the violation, as opposed to producing, you know, the document absent all of the specific parts in that document.
Yeah.
Wouldn't necessarily trigger the violation. It's more of the absence of the document at all would trigger the violation.
Yeah, for me, that's what I would go after, right? And then should they provide, right, they've got the agreement, then, you know, what the regulations provide for is, you know, that very general, do they have a copy of that agreement, right? Between them and the food recovery service. May not be signed, and that may be just fine and a-okay, right? And then also, you know, they have to have identify the food recovery services or organization that are collecting from them, right? And then they have to have a record of the name, address, contact information of the organization, the types of food that will be collected. I'm just reading from the regs.
Frequency.
I'm
clear on all those different parts, and that's what I'm saying is the inspector's looking for those
Yeah.
because it's identified in the regulations as those are the necessary parts.
Yes.
We're not looking for, food safety requirements. We're not looking for
Right.
those things. We're looking for the specific parts that are identified in the regulations.
Yeah.
So essentially it's, like I said before, it's the document that we're looking for, not everything, signed,
Exactly.
dated,
Mhm.
stamped and everything.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And I think that's where, you need to tie together, they provide you the agreement, right? So there's an agreement or agreements, right? And then you see no donations, right? So like, was that agreement ever really executed or implemented? And that's where I think you tie those two pieces together.
Yeah, it seems more the opposite.
Yeah.
Where the donations are occurring, the agreement just isn't there.
Oh, yeah, that's a problem because they need
And
to
then that
have a
would
copy of
be,
that agreement.
that would be an enforceable violation
Yes.
of the SB 1383 regulations.
Yep, correct.
Great.
Yeah.
Awesome. Thanks, Kara.
Thanks.
That saves
Thanks,
me an
Paul, for
email.
sharing.
Appreciate it.
Mhm.
All right, our next question is going to be from Paulina Brenner.
Yeah, hi, thank you, Catherine. Paulina Benner with R3 Consulting Group, and similar question, edible food related. We have edible food generators in some jurisdictions that we have shown through site visit do not have any surplus edible food to donate at this time. And it's unclear to me whether or not we would still require them and then potentially enforce against them to have an agreement with the FRO just in case they have future donations. I understand we would keep them on the list as a tier 1 or tier 2 generator and continue inspecting and educating those generators, but do they have to have an agreement if they don't have surplus edible food right now to donate?
I believe we have previously received this question. I'm going to go ahead
From me.
for that answer. Oh, Kara, please go ahead and chime in.
That's great. We are gonna get the official response, but the basic response is that if they have and confirm no edible food to donate, then it wouldn't necessarily make sense that they need a contract or agreement in place. I think the caveat though is, if at a point in the future, right, they do have edible food to generate, then they are going to need to have that contract or agreement. But we will get, we have provided a response on this in the past, and we'll go ahead and provide that in the Q&A so everyone has that in writing.
Great, that makes sense. Thank you. Yeah, it doesn't make sense to force them right now, but yeah, I mean, clearly educating the generator that if it changes, they have to have it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've heard from and I've heard from some pros saying that that's kind of an administrative burden to have all these agreements with no food coming through. So
yeah, exactly. Yeah. And this also ties to capacity planning. This may be a generator that you identify as 0 because they really don't generate edible food, even though they are defined as a generator. And you could also address that in your capacity planning as well.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Karen.
Hey, thanks for the question.
Right. Next up, I have a question from Laura Sumner. Laura, give me just a moment to find you in the list. Alrighty, you should be able to unmute now. Please go ahead and unmute, state your name and affiliation, and ask your question. Okay, I think she may not be able to unmute, so I'll just go ahead and read the question. She says, we have also received mostly positive responses from giving out the pails. We've ordered enough for about half of our households and have given out about 80% of them in the last year. I see. I think this is a follow-up to the question about whether the pails have been a success. And just anecdotally, some of the jurisdictions I have the pleasure of working with have also used similar pails, and they seem to be quite popular with their residents. All right, our next question is going to be from Tom Sifang. Tom, you should be able to unmute yourself now, and please go ahead and do that and ask your question. Thanks.
Hi, good afternoon. Tom Fong, LA County Sanitation. I was wondering if CalRecycle can speak to whether SB 1383 recovered organic waste procurement requirements are being enforced and whether any jurisdictions are currently complying with their procurement targets.
Yeah. Hi, Tom. Thanks for the question. I appreciate
Hi,
it.
Tara.
So our CalRecycle enforcement team is in the process of completing the first 25 compliance evaluations. And as a part of those compliance evaluations, we are reviewing all of the requirements and determining if a jurisdiction is in compliance or not. We also have 126 jurisdictions that submitted SB 619 extension requests. Some of those jurisdictions, I think it's 78 jurisdictions, have completed those corrective action plans. They will be receiving an evaluation review by CalRecycle. And then there's another group of those 40, my numbers are probably off a little bit, 40 some that requested an extension. I know some of those could be related to hitting the procurement target. And then lastly, we are also identifying and selecting the next group of 130, 40-ish jurisdictions that will receive the next round of compliance evaluations. So again, as a part of those evaluations, Tom, we will be reviewing what the jurisdiction has done to comply with the procurement requirements. We'd have to run the report. So what's tricky about answering your second question about our jurisdictions currently complying with their procurement targets, obviously with AB 1985, it created required jurisdictions to achieve a percentage of their target starting with 2023. We do not yet have the annual reports for those jurisdictions for 2023. We won't get those until August. So a little bit too early for us to tell. What we have been doing with all jurisdictions is the local assistance staff have been setting up individual meetings annually with the jurisdictions and reviewing all of their program implementation. And for jurisdictions that are struggling to meet their procurement target, we've been meeting with them to kind of really brainstorm all of the options that they could avail themselves of. So having a lot of one-on-one conversations with what jurisdictions might consider, including procuring compliance attributes from in-vessel digestion facilities, like some of LA Sands facilities that are putting RNG into the pipeline, for example, or biomass facilities that are putting electricity onto the grid, as well as utilizing direct service provider agreements. We're just produced a new video to help explain how jurisdictions can utilize direct service provider agreements with, say, agricultural, like farms and whatnot, as and utilizing their composting facility as kind of that in-between broker. Does that help, Tom? Do you have any follow-ups?
No, that's good. Yeah, sounds like there are different facets to that, and it's good to hear what you guys are doing. And if you have that video, I would like to see that. That would be great to see.
Great. Yeah, we will. I'm not sure where we're at on getting that out and disseminated, but we will be sending it out on the 1383 listserv as soon as it's ready. It should be pretty close to being ready. And then I think, lastly, I want to put in a plug for the local assistance team. I think it's really important that, we have there are some wastewater treatment plants, for example, that are putting electricity onto the grid. We have a number of in-vessel digestion facilities that are putting RNG into the pipeline. And, there are opportunities for jurisdictions to, enter into a contract to procure those compliance attributes. And so there's just a lot of different approaches that can be taken. And we really appreciate the opportunity to help in supporting jurisdictions and thinking about those solutions. Thanks, Tom.
Thank you, Carl. Yes, we are not currently doing RNG pipeline injection, but we're getting together DSP agreements and probably an RFP regarding our electricity that we're producing from RNG. So
Fantastic, Tom. Yeah. The other thing, Tom, that sometimes Katie, I'm so sorry we're getting off on procurement, but we'll take a few minutes if that's okay. But with respect to procurement, another opportunity that I think is sometimes missed is any electricity that or heating, etc., that the facility is using for its own operations is something else that a jurisdiction could contract with a facility or multiple jurisdictions. And that facility would then be the direct service provider. So entering in a direct service provider agreement so that that facility is utilizing, right, the RNG or electricity derived from that in-vessel digestion process to run its operations is something that I think a lot of folks aren't thinking about, but that's a great direct service provider opportunity there.
yes, exactly. That's what we're doing.
Perfect. Thanks, Tom.
Thank you, Carl.
All right, thanks everyone for your questions. It looks like that is it for our open questions, although we will be following up with one participant question via email after this. If you think of a question after the webinar is over, please go ahead and send it to us at slcp.organics@calrecycle.gov. I'm just going to go over some of the questions which we've answered in writing in the Q&A pane. You should be able to see those if you are on the meeting now, but I want to just quickly read them off until we hit 3 o'clock at least, so that we can get as many of them as possible into the YouTube recording as well for the folks watching after the webinar is over. All right, so our first question we answered in writing was from Isaac Bravo. Is asking, was the determination by the city attorney of Modesto based on the template ordinance provided by CalRecycle? And what triggered involvement by the city attorney? Mariah Hill from Modesto responded to say Modesto's code updates under SB 1383 were based on CalRecycle's template ordinance, but the city attorney interpreted our relationship with commercial accounts as not being able to change their service on their behalf because we are not account holders. Attorney became involved about a month into our initial launch of distributing recycling containers when businesses complained to city leadership. I think that may be unique to Modesto. So that is how their city attorneys came to be involved in that. Rosie Ledisma asked, can you provide details on why commercial accounts could not just have services changed and delivered to them automatically? That has more or less the same answer, and it is that the city attorney determined that Modesto's municipal code does not allow the city to send containers to commercial accounts. They had to change their own service with the hauler. Up next, Tammy Stolzen. Oh, we answered that one live. Terribly sorry. All right, up next, we have a question from Jeffrey Wong. What is the contamination threshold used for tagged containers before triggering a pause in service? The city of Modesto uses a threshold of 1% for their tags. They pause service until the customer calls and talks to staff and removes contamination.
Hey, Katie,
yes.
Can we ask our presenter for City of Modesto to share a little bit about how they deal with she talked a little bit about it, but bagged material, whether it's the gray, blue, or green container, and dealing with that. Hey,
Absolutely.
Jody, do you mind?
Go ahead, Jody.
Not at all. Can you clarify, what do you mean by dealing with bagged material? Do you mean?
Yeah, one of the questions we received is, you're doing a route review. Maybe you're reviewing the great containers, right? And people typically bag all of their material. So if you lift that can and you're doing it as, you may not see anything. And, ultimately our goal is to make sure that generators are complying with the requirements. So how do you deal with, on a route review, bagged material? You talked a little bit about it.
Yeah, that's a great question. So we do open the bags. Staff are provided with hay hooks and litter grabbers and gloves, different types of gloves, whether that's just, the typical PPE gloves that you'd see, or if those are needle-proof gloves, we also have those. And yeah, we would open the bags, and we always get photo documentation as well. And then as far as removing a tag from a container, the generator would need to remove the contamination, and then they call us or they can email us to schedule a reinspection. And so the following week, the day before service, or if it's a commercial account that has more than one service day per week, we just go out the next day prior to service and verify that the contamination has been removed, and then we would release that hold.
Thanks, Jody. I think that's super helpful. Do any of our other presenters want to speak to how they deal with route reviews and contamination monitoring? And then I do know quite a few jurisdictions do some kind of like mini waste characterizations on various routes and take that material back to a facility, and then they're checking through that material. So did any of the other presenters have anything to share, add to Jody's comments? And if you don't, that's okay. All right, Katie, back to you.
All right. The next question that was answered in writing in our queue is from Jeffrey Wong. Oh, wait, sorry. It's from Rosie Ledesma. She's asking whether the enforcement notices given to the business owner or property owner are different. Mariah Hill says that the city of Modesto mails to all addresses they have on file. They also mail directly to the physical address and the billing address to try and reach the right person. Ultimately, the account holder is the responsible party for citations if things are contested, but this allows us to reach the people who are actually on site and can change the behavior. The next question was from Pete Olson, who is asking who generally applies for waivers. What are some of the reasons for doing so? The city of Modesto replied, in our experience, the business owner or a corporate owner is most likely to apply for waivers as they are trying to minimize costs. Makes sense. Possible reasons are not producing enough waste to justify additional containers or a de minimis waiver, or not having enough space for the additional containers, space constraints. Although I will say I have seen some places with some major space constraints somehow manage to fit their containers in there. It's remarkable sometimes the level of Tetris some people can do with those. So if you are issuing those types of waivers, that is great, but there are also creative solutions available. The next question is from Konya Vivanti, asking whether they can obtain a copy of the City of Modesto's letters and notices to bins. She can send those to us at CalRecycle, and also provided her email in there, Konya. If you didn't see it, please go ahead and send her an email. You can also send us an email at slcp.organics@calrecycle.ca.gov, and we would be happy to connect you. And I'm starting to run out of time, but we have 5 minutes for just a few more written questions. Paige Lowe asked Jody whether what percentage of violations, if any, are related to the edible surplus donation requirements of SB 1383? The City of Modesto Solid Waste Supervisor says they have 18 open cases for edible food recovery violations, and that is less than 5% of their cases at any given time. They're focusing on education with edible food recovery, but have had to issue notices for Tier 1 generators who refuse to engage with us. None have gone to notice and order yet. Casey Fritz of Zero Waste Marin asks, how are you able to collect citations and who actually issues the citation and collects the money? Our team doesn't have authority to do that, and we are trying to figure out how to actually implement this final step. And after you collect, where does the money get spent? Elise Lebsack says they have the authority to pass ordinances and assess fines through the Alameda County Waste Management Authority. Staff who issue citations as enforcement officials have had additional training and are designated within our agency's enforcement policy to issue citations. The money collected from citations goes into general agency revenue and is spent based on agency priorities. All right, that's the end of the questions. And I'm going to pass things back off to Carla Miller. Carla, please take it away.
Okay, all right, everyone. We've reached the end of our time today. I want to give enormous thanks to our presenters and all of our attendees who participated today. These chats would not be possible without you, and we truly appreciate the level of engagement from our stakeholders. So in case you've missed anything today, all of our chats are recorded and will be posted on our website. If you would like updates on future chats, resources, and web page updates, please subscribe to our SB 1383 listserv. Thank you all for tuning in, staying engaged, and participating. And Marshall has a few words to close us out.
Hello again, and I echo the gratitude conveyed by Carla and appreciate everybody's participation. As you know, we do this pretty much once a month, so I'm happy to announce that on June 19th at 1 o'clock, we'll have our next chat, and we'll be focusing on the implementation record. And with, Kara talked about earlier that CalRecycle is in the process of the 35 or 25 compliance evaluations started last year, and then implementing over 100 more this year. And the very first step is for, one of the first steps is for CalRecycle to review each jurisdiction's implementation record. So we want to make sure that we're getting everybody ready for that and providing related assistance. So that will be the focus for the 19th, and I hope to see each of you there. Thank you again for participating.
Enjoy the rest of your day, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks all. Good job.